Hey everyone, welcome back to Old World Legends, where we focus on building the Warhammer community. I'm your host Mike, and with me as always is Evan.
Hey, I'm feeling legendary today.
Every day, right? Every day legendary.
Every day is legendary.
Um, I love it. But today we're going to continue our series going through some of the army factions. And in case you can't tell from the title of the video you clicked on or the images behind us, we're going to talk about Bretonnia, one of our favorite factions because not only is it amazing, but it is a old world only faction, which makes it
Yeah.
even more special. It's one of our favorites. Evan,
Yeah,
what's
they,
one
they
of your
don't
favorite
have
things about
France in
Bretonnia?
AOS. No, no, they don't.
Well, they've had different flavors. Certainly, France as a theme is very strong in it, but they've also
Hmm.
had, they have definitely elements of, King Arthur mixed into there too, and elements of Excalibur and the Lady of the Lake. So it's definitely more French than anything in its themes and tones, but it definitely
Hmm.
has some of that England and historical Knights of the Round Table mixed in there as well.
Yeah, I think the
I think
Lady of
that's
the
probably
Lake
why
part's
it's
probably
really
my
popular.
my favorite. That kind of like weird, creepy. Everyone else would run for the hills, but you're like, wow, she's kind of hot. So I guess I'll do whatever you say. You know, I like it.
Well, to each your own. So let's dive into this book. So why don't you take us to it, Evan?
All right, so we got the army list here. Um, so Bretonnia is the most common, essentially beginner army. I believe right now it's that kind of beginner army box has sold a bit more than the Tomb Kings one, and there's a good reason for that. I think that the models are very colorful, and with the big beginner box, you get what looks like a full army. You got knights, you got Pegasus, you got this big character who's on this royal steed, and I think everyone can connect with the idea and the theme that you've got these
Mm-hmm.
heroic characters, and they're all just going to rush out there and just be gallant. It's
Yeah,
the
it's
ride of the
popular,
Rohirrim.
very popular, great army box. It
Mm-hmm.
looks beautiful, absolutely beautiful when it's on the tabletop. It's so unique. And who doesn't love, knights in shining armor riding off to battle, right? It's just so iconic. So definitely a very popular faction.
Absolutely. And at the same time, it's also one of the top tier competitive armies. So you see some of the best players in the world also
Mm-hmm.
playing Bretonnia lists pretty consistently. It's got a pretty good, essentially top tier win rate with those very narrow lists that are kind of competing in the meta at the moment. So you can very much go from zero to hero with this army, right? You can start with, I'm going to just get my box going. I just want to paint some of my models to, okay, I want to win some events. And I can use the same models to do it. I don't need to, switch to a different faction or trade out all of my beginner stuff and start taking these weird, obscure things. It's pretty straightforward. And so I think that ramp to success is, it's all open. Everyone's there, right?
Yeah, definitely for if this is your first army, it's a great first army. It's
Mm-hmm.
great for onboarding, ramping into the game. You don't need too many models to get going. A lot of the models are very impactful, and a lot of the models you need come in that starter box, which is a
Yes.
great value. So there's a lot of reasons why this army is popular,
Mm-hmm.
and it is competing very, as you said, very strongly as well. But let's dive into the Grand Army composition. So anything stand out to you there on the character side of thing?
Yeah, so pretty uniquely, I believe that there's really only one other faction that basically gets their combat lord as a 0 to 1 choice with no per
Mm-hmm.
1,000 points. And so, what this means with the 0 to 1 Duke is that no matter how many points you're playing at, you can always bring the Duke to that battle. And then you can also bring, prophetesses and barons and that sort. And with the, Bretonian characters not riding 300-point dragons and instead riding, much more cost effective Pegasi and horses and things, you can actually often bring three powerful characters, and most other people only get to bring two. So that is a very interesting advantage that you get from here. So even at like a 1,500-point game, you can bring a Duke, a Prophetess, and for example a Paladin BSB, even at that points
Yep.
level. Yeah.
But you are restricted versus some other armies like, hey, I could have sometimes two Chaos Lords, or I could have two Vampire Counts, or I could have two,
Two
right,
Chaos
different
Lords? You can't have two
different
Chaos
factions.
Lords.
Well, maybe
There's
not
only one.
two
There's only
Chaos
one suit of full plate armor in this whole, rotten kingdom. You can only give it to one dude. That
But your
exalted
point is,
champion, he's
right,
wearing heavy armor. I don't know why, but
um, you can't have everything, and
no.
this army definitely restricts that melee character, as Evan said, right? Different
Yeah.
factions have different compositions, and that is one that's specific to this. All right, so that's definitely something that stands out from the character side.
Yes.
What about the core side?
So the core is interesting because you do have a 1+ requirement on both a Knights of the Realm unit and a Men at Arms or Peasant Bowman unit. Now that's interesting because a lot of
Hmm.
the other armies do not have this. There's no 1+ requirement for Chaos Knights or Chaos Warriors on foot, for example, and 1+ Marauders. There's nothing like that. So a lot of the other armies are very open to what you can do. However, that really isn't a problem because Knights of the Realm and Peasant Bowmen and Men at Arms are pretty much just the staples of every army. And if you want to have a fully mounted force of only cavalry, well, we got news for you because there's the Infantry Crusade, and then you get to just charge further as well, and you can just have everyone be on a horse. So knock yourself out.
Yep, definitely see a lot of that, and I think you said that right. It is interesting that they have two entries there
Yeah.
that are 1+. That's also uncommon. Most rosters, some rosters don't have any requirements of one at all, but they have two, so that is fairly specific to the
Mm-hmm.
Bretonnia roster here. One of the cool things, and we'll talk about it more as we get down below, is the on foot Knights of the Realm. One of the new kits they released. One of the only brand new units models that they released when this army box came out, and it's a beautiful kit. They did a great job with that. So it's nice for some Bretonnia players who do want to have those knights on foot. There are some great options for that now as well that they didn't used to have these. That's a new thing.
Yeah. And then you got these peasant bowmen, and they provide that every single guy. That's 5-point, 6-point models have longbows. That's
Mm-hmm.
amazing. You just get a whole ton of longbowmen. I mean, Agincourt, am I right? Like that's what I'm thinking. Um, but what's interesting also about the core is that this is just all the guys that you get in that starter box. So unlike maybe some of the other armies, basically your starter box, your army box that you're buying, is going to be your core forever. It's just that's the models you need, right? There's no like weird special. Oh, if you do this, you can have black orcs or something like that. You're gonna have all the core you need in that one main box, and then you're
Mm-hmm.
set. So it's
I
also
agree.
kind of good in terms of you can't really go wrong with what you're buying, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. All right, so let's move on to special.
Mm-hmm. So in special, we have squires, which are like basically just much better version of the Empire archers. So we have longbows, but you get to scout. This is a nice tech unit. I think that if more Bretonnian units were or Bretonnian armies were kind of playing defensively, they would love to have squires, but usually they're just so aggressive they don't need them.
Mm-hmm.
Questing knights, so you have knights who are just complete beefcakes with their strength 4 and their great weapon, and they're just like, I'm gonna hit you in the face. I really love that aesthetic. Pegasus Knights who are just mobile as all hell, and you just go out there and you get to fly around and you murder everything. I think they're very much meta defining at the moment. They're your dragon, essentially, and they get to be an
Mm-hmm.
entourage for your character. So your character gets to fly around with his best friends and they get to go murder everything.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the special slot is packed with goodness here. I mean, even battle pilgrims are very, good for just sitting there and not wanting to run away because they're just so devout and they love the lady
I
quite a
think
bit.
everyone's just
Yeah.
focused so much on the Pegasus Knights with this faction right now that some of the other special units don't get nearly as much attention. They're not bad. They're just
Yeah.
Pegasus Knights inherently are currently so much better. But again, the meta changes, things change, right? That won't
Yeah.
always be a true statement. And I think for the grand army composition here, Bretonnia, and again, another thing that stands out is a lot of factions will have that restriction, as you see with the battle program 0 to 1, 0 to 2 per 1,000 points and such. And most of those special entries do not have that points restrict or unit to points restriction ratio, right? It's fairly just open there. So that's something that's also not as common in all the other grand armies.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Um, Cool. So rare.
Rare
Not a lot of
units.
entries here.
No, no. In fact, there aren't that many units in the Bretonian list. But then the fact that they're basically all takeable and very good in different circumstances, that's amazing, right? So you're not just going to buy a bunch of models and then be like, well, I guess I'll wait until next edition when they're really good, right? You
Hmm.
use them right away. So you got Grail Knights, who are essentially the envy of every other human knight that's out there. He's got his strength 4, his toughness 4, and his 2 attacks. So he's basically like, hey, I'm a blood knight, but I'm alive, right? It's
Hmm.
pretty great.
Hmm.
And you got magical
Super
attacks and your weapon
powerful.
skill 6. That's just. I think a lot of people are going to go down the route of, wow, I really just want to have Grail Knights in my army because of how cool their stats are. They're basically like an
Hmm.
Empire, Grand Master, but every single dude is that. You have a whole squad of them.
They're so cool. And when you see someone have a painted up Grail Knight unit, it's just a centerpiece. Just an incredible centerpiece for the army.
Yeah. And then you have the trebuchets, which can provide that artillery support. It's a strength 5 blast with its catapult, which is pretty unique.
Hmm.
And you can bring those to help support your army as well. Although no unit is giving you that reroll on the misfire dice, which is something that, as an Empire player, I find risky because you don't want your peasants to blow themselves up.
Yeah. So overall, right, it's
Mm-hmm.
a very compact army composition. They did add the new unit here, but it's surprising with they don't have nearly as broad of a roster as some of the older factions or some of the other armies out there. But you can
Mm-hmm.
still do so much with it, and I think that comes through a lot of the customization, the different unit sizes, the different magic items and vows and compositions. That there's still a whole bunch of army that you can make here, and it's surprisingly enough, there's quite a bit of variety that you will see on the tabletop with this faction as well.
Yeah, I think the virtues are one of the main reasons for that. So you can take virtues. For example, you can put a virtue on your Grail Knight champion. You can put your virtues on your characters, and so the virtues help provide these units more power.
Cool. All right, so that's the composition. So let's move on. Let's talk about some actual units, unless we run into something else first. Let's scroll down.
Yeah, so just real fast, so you get to have your battle standard bearer for free as Bretonnians, and when your paladins
Oh,
are pretty cheap as well, just sticking him on the warhorse or on the Royal Pegasus and flying him around, that's quite a nice bonus, especially because in every other army you got to pay 25 points for your battle standard bearer upgrade. Then you're probably buying a banner, and then if this guy's killed, now he's worth that many more points, plus the 100 points you get for capturing his banner. So battle standard bearers can be both a great boon to your army and also just this massive point sink. And oh, I lost by 100 points. How did that happen? Well, the battle standard bearer died, right? But just making them a bit cheaper and more accessible. That's an interesting proposition.
yeah. I didn't notice that box there. Got to read the box.
So the Lords of Bretonnia, we've got the 3 levels. Now this is pretty interesting and unique that you actually have 3 levels of characters because most people just have that like hero level. They've got 50 points of magic items. A lot of their stats are lower and they start with the 2 wounds, so they're kind of
Hmm.
vulnerable, especially
Hmm.
to multi-wound attacks. And then, but with Lords of Bretonnia, you have 3 levels, and the Baron's got 3 wounds, and then you have a Duke with 4 wounds. And when you just have a baseline character with 4 wounds, that's pretty great. Like that is
Yeah, I
awesome.
mean he's not cheap at 175 baseline, but he has a fairly competitive stat line. It's not a one to one with a Chaos Lord, and a Vampire count has a little bit more, but he's right up there in terms of human sized model stat lines. Pretty beefy.
Yeah, he has more attack and more wounds than the Vampire Lord. He also comes
Hmm.
with the ward save from the prayer by default because he has the Grail Vow.
Yeah,
Whereas,
he doesn't have the toughness though. Yeah.
yeah, so if you take the Paladin or the Baron and buy the Grail Vow, then they're 80 and 120 respectively. So he's really only
Hmm.
55 points more than a Baron with the Vow.
Hmm.
Yeah, and then these characters that because they come with the blessings of the lady and get to have the ward save essentially built in. That means you get to spend all of your points on offense if you want, or
So
at the
what is
very
the
least,
blessing of the lady? You've said it a
yeah.
couple times now.
Well, Bretonia are very
Hmm.
special because they like to pray and they have they found religion and apparently their religion works and a lot of the other people's religion doesn't work. I'm gonna take
Don't
that up with
don't
them later.
question the system. Don't question the system.
Where's my Sigmar word save? Okay, so blessings of the lady. So if the Bretonian player playing Grand Army prays at the start of the game, which means that they don't get the first turn, they surrender it to their opponent. Then all of their knights who have the blessing of the lady rule will have a 4+ or a 5+ word save versus anything that's a strength high enough to hurt them, or just a 6+ word save otherwise. So that means that all of these characters, it's very similar to the Chaos Lords, having that Chaos Armor 5+, where these guys just have the word save built in, and they didn't need to
Hmm.
spend any of their magic item points to get it.
Yeah,
Right?
it's a great buff, and it's something that's very unique to Bretonnia. And again, it's the player's choice. If that, in case that wasn't clear there, right? So at the
Yeah.
start of the game, I rock up to the table with my opponent, and I see, I'm playing my Bretonnia army, and oh, I'm playing against whatever you're playing against. They have a choice. Either A, they want the blessing, which is great because you get that ward save. You just get it for the whole most of the army,
Mm-hmm.
and but you automatically just say you go first, right? So the other
Yeah.
person gets to go first, and a lot of the times you're okay with that. Sometimes you don't want that, and that's a judgment call you're going to have to make as a player. Sometimes you're like, That's a lot of guns over there on that Empire roster, or something else that's just as scary over there. I would really rather not go first, but roll the dice with my opponent in hopes that I'll go first. So, right there's a gamble either way. There's no guarantee, but most players will say the ward save is totally worth it, and certainly for points efficiency, it really can add up over the course of the game. But just knowing you're going to go second, you start building strategies and tactics for going second, right? Rather than a lot of the players, you need to have your go first strategy, your go second strategy. If you know that you're going to pray most of the time with this army, you just start planning for deploying your army with the knowledge that you were going to go second.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Lords of Bretonnia, they have pretty limited weapon options. It's basically just you get a lance, if you want to be mounted, and that's a pretty great option, especially if you go for certain, virtues. Or a great weapon.
Mm-hmm.
That's also, a really good option for characters who want to do some damage. Or you buy a magic weapon, right? And then you could be mounted. You can have a shield. You cannot have full plate armor. However, as long as you have heavy armor, shield, and barding on something, then you're at least at the 3 up, right? So that's a pretty good armor save to start with. And they do have an item that's going to help you get 1 point higher. And we'll talk about that later. And like I said, the paladin, a lot of characters, they got that 50 points of magic items, and they might have to spend most of it just trying to stay alive, right? And the paladin, he can already have that with his prayer. So then he can then spend those points buying something else. And the same thing for the baron. That's why a baron, either on a royal pegasus or a hippogriff, can feel about as strong as a lot of other lord level characters. Things like an empire general on a griffin is basically the same as or weaker than the baron, even though he has less points and magic items to spend.
Yeah, definitely very punchy. Really good stat lines, pretty decent mounts. But again, of course, as Evan was pointing out, they don't have dragons, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so that is one of the difference here, right? They'll have Pegasus. You can be on foot. You can be on a horse. Do they have do they have a monster at all, Evan? I
Yeah,
don't
the
remember.
hippogriff. Now,
They have a
what's funny
hippogriff.
about the hippogriff is it's the same base size as the Royal Pegasus, and the official model for it is, it's metal, and it's basically smaller than a Royal Pegasus because it's basically kind of like this big.
Well,
Um,
that model came out a long time ago,
oh,
Evan.
no, oh, it did. Oh, it did. Yeah, we won't talk about the fact that there was no Bretonnia release for 20 years until, basically a year ago, right?
Yes,
So,
but the latest one is fantastic. So
yes,
they're trying to
absolutely.
make up for it.
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
So they have that, right. But again, you are building this army differently. This is definitely it's not a dragon army like some of the others, which is nice because there are a lot of dragons out there, and we love dragons. They're great, but it's also nice to see something that's not that. So that is different here. So you talked about some of the gear, you
Mm-hmm.
talked about some of the magic items, but then it talks about questing vows and grail vows. Those was like two different entries. So walk us
Yes.
through the difference there.
So basically, different units in your army, including the heroes and the lords here, have different vows that they take. Essentially, the baseline one is the knight's vow. It is the vow that basically says, you can basically ignore the panicking and running away of the peasants nearby, and you can then share your leadership with those peasants. So, in theory, a kind of a combined arms force with knights and peasants side by side can have extra
Hmm.
synergy. In the same way that like orcs, don't care about goblins running away and stuff like that. That's kind of a the vibe that you get from it. And then the questing
Okay.
vow is the upgrade that essentially, as soon as knights have, decided they're going to go on that quest to try to find, the lady's bathwater or something,
The
essentially.
Grail. The Grail. It's the quest for the Grail.
Yeah, so I guess the Grail
Right.
Knights are the ones who've already drinking from the Grail. Am I getting that right?
Correct.
Okay.
Hmm.
So yeah,
Yeah.
so the questing vow is, basically gives you stubborn. That's essentially the upgrade over the baseline one. And if you're a lone character, stubborn can be quite great because you can be fighting something that causes terror, and then you're taking your leadership test on, maybe it's a leadership, 8 or 7. If someone's starting to debuff you, that could be pretty scary. So just having stubborn is good.
So if you
However,
upgrade the questing vow, do you
yeah,
still retain the benefits of the knightly vow?
yeah, it's basically it's not so much that
So it
you
is an
retain it.
upgrade.
It's that, yeah, it's
Okay.
just a flat upgrade, and it's just copy and pasted essentially with all the night vow stuff with that added on.
Okay.
And then with the
And then
Grail
the Grail
vow,
vow.
you finally essentially get to where, first of all, you always have the prayer, even if you don't pray at the beginning of the game. So you always have that word save protecting you.
Awesome.
It gives you immune to psychology, which helps you, not run away from, dragons and things charging you. Which,
Yep.
I
Terror,
mean,
stuff like that.
yeah, it's
Hmm.
actually funny to, you can build this really strong unit and then be like, oh, they run away. Oops, I
That
didn't think of
happens.
that.
Yeah. Immune psychology is very powerful. Absolutely.
Well, it's powerful, and yet it's also potentially a downside because if you have any immune to psychology models in your unit, you can't flee. So if you have a
Yeah.
Duke with the Grail Vow in your unit of Pegasus Knights, they cannot flee from a charge. just because
Hmm.
he's there, right? So
And just to be clear, that's not specific to the Grail Valve. That's just things that have
specific
immune to
to,
psychology.
yes, immune psychology in general. So it's good to know, but I mean, I think most people are going to be countercharging anyway, so that's essentially a much
Hmm.
less of a downside for those units. Okay.
Okay, so that explains the vows and
Mm-hmm.
going through the tiers. That's great. So clearly, more points you spend, the more benefits you get, and you have to decide if it's worth spending those points or not. But then there's virtues on
Mm-hmm.
top of vows, and those are not the same thing, are they?
No, it's good to keep those separate. So I mean, so vows are just kind of general. There's three in the main book, and then there's the Exile's vow and the Crusader's vow that are different for the armies of infantry, but you only get those when you're playing that specific army of infantry. The
So those are the
Yeah,
Arcane Journal, which
yes,
we'll cover in a future episode. Yeah.
yes, and so the knightly virtues are essentially your way to make this human character, who is a mortal human, superhuman. I mean, you basically say this guy he's Captain America, this guy he's Iron Man, because when you put that virtue on these characters, they become very very strong, and they will stand up and slap a Chaos Lord in the face, and not be worried about what's coming back. So we'll get to the virtues later when we're talking about those, but this is something really unique about your army that is going to make the Lord of Bretonnia basically outclass the other kind of human level lords in most ways.
Hmm.
In fact,
Cool.
like we were saying, the Duke, he's got better stats than the Vampire Lord. So, dang.
Except the toughness. Um,
Yeah. Well,
so
there might be a way to fix that, Mike.
I'm sure there are many ways to change many things. Just out of the gate, we're talking about. So you start with the great stats to start with,
Yeah.
reasonable points. Not as many mount options, but the Pegasus mount is always a very strong mount for a lot of reasons we'll cover in a little bit.
Yeah.
Then you can upgrade with your vows, depending on if you want to upgrade or not. You don't have to. You can stick with the knightly vow. Then you can take a single virtue. You see, there's not a points entry there, so it's just saying you may take one. So whatever the points are, you add that because sometimes like the vampiric powers, it says this is how many powers you can take within this points cost. But you could take multiples of those within that points threshold. This is
Yeah.
just you may take a single one. So there is different important nuances between different armies and how they're constructed and how you craft your heroes. And then on top of that,
Yeah.
you can also take magic items, so you can really customize this character.
Yeah. And also, it's worth noting that the knightly virtues are unique, so you can only have one character in your army with each individual one. You can't have the same one repeated, so that's good to
Good
know.
to know.
Whereas I think there are ogre big names don't have that limitation, but that's nuances of the different books.
Hmm. Okay, cool. And then that's pretty straightforward. Anything else on that? Moving on. All
Yeah.
right. The handmaidens of the lady. What are
Hmm.
those? Are those are the witches of the army?
Yeah, they're definitely witches. I think they cast magic from some unknown sorcery origin, and so I mean, like we were saying earlier, having that limitation removed, where you don't have to choose between your duke and your prophetess, means that you often get to take a duke, a baron, and a prophetess, and fit all of them in your army, and that is very very strong. A lot of armies wish they could do that. So the prophetess can be upgraded to level 4 wizard. Having the
Mhm.
100 points of magic items really lets you take a very strong arcane item or a more expensive arcane item and still have other ways to buff up your unit or bring a ruby ring of ruin, for example. Whereas a lot of like the lower level wizards with fewer points won't be able to fit all of that stuff, right? Now, something that's interesting about these handmaidens, so a lot of other human characters at this level will be toughness 4, and they aren't. However, the handmaidens of the lady do provide some great benefits to their unit. So they have magic resistance 2, and they give the unit they're in magical attacks. So we don't see this very often, but you could take a handmaiden and either put them on a Pegasus and join the a royal Pegasus and join the Pegasus Knights and give them
Mhm.
magical
Mhm.
attacks and magic resistance,
Mhm.
right? Or you can put them on a horse and join them into a unit of Knights of the Realm and do the same thing. Um, and you can do this with much more impunity than most armies would want to put their wizards in the front lines, because you can use the Shield of the Lady to basically put your character in the back away from the fighting rank, as long as there's unit strength 10 or
Scroll
more.
a little bit so we can see that and walk
Yeah.
us through what is Shield of the Lady. How does that work?
Yeah,
Give us
so
a
it's
high level.
yeah, so the high level is essentially that your character, your wizard can sit in a unit, but if they ever
Mhm.
get into combat, they can then say, you know what, I think the knights are going to take all this, and I'm going to go wait in the back. So you get to then move away from the fighting rank, but pretty much at any time, and then they can still provide the benefits from like their spells and their leadership and their magic resistance and things like that, even though they're not within range to be attacked. Which,
Can
if
they
you're
still
in
cast and dispel if they're in the back too?
Yes, I think there is some debate about whether they can cast assailment spells specifically. And obviously, you can't dispel when you're in combat. However, if you're in a unit like Pegasus Knights that's going to charge in, and you win the combat, you could just restrain, and then now you can dispel again. So there you go, right? And like we were saying earlier, like because the slots are open, you might be able to just take multiple wizards anyway. So maybe one of them being locked in combat is fine because the other one can do the dispelling. Yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
super powerful ability to do that. So often you're going to
mhm.
see this if she's with a unit of knights, for example, right, and they're in the lance formation, right. She would typically be in one of the front fighting ranks so that she can see to cast spells if she has some spells that require line of sight,
Mhm.
or right, a lot of reasons why she's going to need to be in the front, but that's the primary one. But then rather than where a lot of other wizards never want to get into combat, because as soon as they get tagged in combat, they don't get to dispel, they don't get to cast spells unless, of course, there's always some exceptions, assailment spells, things of that sort. So it's typically very, very bad for them. But this army, right, is a charge forward with your knight type of army. So they have the wizards in this army, the maidens have these special rules that allow them for the unit to that she's protected with, going with, slam into someone, go to the back rank, and still be an effective caster. So that is something specific and very cool.
Well, just to point out, the Skaven get to do this too. So maybe we should check to see
That
if these handmaidens
that's
have
true.
tails under their dress.
Uh, well, that I don't know. And as you mentioned earlier, magic resistance 2 is a fantastic benefit. That's
Yeah.
very, very powerful. And then we see they can take battle magic, elementalism, and illusion. So, what are some of the main combos that you typically have seen out there, Evan, with this character?
So these are probably the most competitive and the strongest of the three, of the main lores of magic in the game. So that's amazing. You can basically use battle magic to be a very good supporting long range caster with more shooting and more things like pillar of fire, being able to just have board control, or
Hmm.
you can use the elementalism lore, which is very popular for plague of rust, wind blast, and travel mystical pathways, being able to move around the battlefield and support your units as you go. I find that would be it's often used to benefit armies that have a lot of shooting. So if you had a lot of longbowmen, elementalism would probably be one thing you'd want to look at. And
Hmm.
illusion is also one of the other best lords in the game, particularly because of the way that you can use it to help shut down the most powerful units in the army from being able to come after you. So if you have more defensive infantry blocks, things like that, illusion can be great to help keep people out of touching you. And glittering robe is an amazing spell, and it stacks with your ward save, so you can be harder to hit, and at the same time have that ward save. Whereas, for example, battle magic getting you oaken shield, right? You already have the ward save, so that's not really doing much else to protect you, and neither is earthen ramparts, right? So illusion, probably the best one out of these. That's just
I think it's relative to how you're
you know,
building your army.
yeah,
Part of the challenge with a lot of the illusion spells, of course, is they are generally higher casting values, right? So it just depends on what you're going into. But definitely battle magic for if you want to be offensive with a lot of your spells, the fireballs, the pillar of fires. There's a lot of reasons why to go with battle magic. Elementalism really gives you that utility build, right? In
mm-hmm.
terms of it has a lot of good. It has some movement stuff. It has some defense stuff. Right? It has a multiple facets of utility, which is great for the player that wants to be more flexible with what they're doing on the battlefield, depending on the situation. Versus illusion is more control, right? In
Yeah.
terms of I want to shut down this charge or debuff this or control that. A lot of control there. So yeah, I think we saw a lot more illusion taken at the beginning of the edition. I think we're seeing more battle magic now. I think that's generally because they have lower casting values, and it's always fun to just throw a fireball or do some damage out there. And generally speaking, the Bretonnian army does not have as much range attack potential as many other armies typically have more potential. So usually, a lot of people will go that route to shore up one of the things that the army does less of. But I don't think there's a right or wrong answer there. It's really the kind of build that you're going for and how you're going to handle different situations.
Yeah, and also just battle magic has arcane urgency, which if you have units that are
Very
very
true.
fast, like your Pegasus Knights with your riding, flying units, you can use that to tremendous effect. In fact, you can cast arcane urgency on a unit that just failed a charge and just be like, well, I'm just gonna fly them out of there. So a pretty common tactic is you can march your dragon 20 inches up the board and then cast arcane urgency and fly them again. Well, guess what? You can also do that with your flying Bretonnian units. So arcane urgency just kind of scales with how fast you already are and makes that even better.
Mm-hmm. Yep, as long as you get that spell off. All right, anything else for the Wizards of the Bretonnia Force?
No.
All right, let's move on. Yep, great entry, very strong, very competitive.
Yeah, so there's
Mm,
also a peasant character. He exists.
of course, absolutely. So tell us about the Sergeant at Arms, a strong, a whopping 45 points, Evan. So what does he do and why would you bring him?
Um, I don't know. I don't see them. I think that the
Because he's
main
awesome, obviously.
he gets to be
But
strength
beyond that,
four, so he's obviously pumping some iron. Um,
hmm
yeah, so I think the idea behind this character is that you can bring essentially a peasant character to help support your peasant infantry, help them hold their ground. So it gives it right here under peasant's duty, it lets them choose to give ground rather than fall back. So this is essentially the same
hmm
thing as like shield wall, except it can happen multiple times. Um, that's
I think it's one
nice.
of those thematic entries,
Yeah, it's
honestly.
thematic. Yeah,
And again, if we talked about, hey, maybe you want to build an all knight force, right? Hey, if you really want to make a peasant focused army, right, that you could have some of these characters. And again, it might not be, hey, let's go compete at some meta events, but for a fun narrative game, right, different scenarios, you can have a lot of fun with this. So
yeah.
I love that they do have that aspect of the army, right, the knights and the peasants represented here, and that you can take this character, even if maybe it's not the strongest character, that's okay. You can still have a lot of fun with it.
Yeah, he's also really cheap.
Hmm Yep.
So I think
Firm
the
footed
mounts
dragon.
are really important in the
Okay.
Bretonnian army. So you can see here that the Duke, the Baron, the Paladin, they can be mounted on Warhorse, Barded Pegasus, Royal Pegasus, and then only the Duke and Barons on the Hippogriff. So the
hmm
Hippogriff has very similar stat line to like an Empire Griffin, except that essentially the Hippogriff can buy barding, which is very nice because then your heavy armor
Mm.
shield, lance for example, Hippogriff. Now you're on a 2+ or a 3+ armor save, right? Whereas if you couldn't do that, that's a big monster that's only on a 4+ armor save, and that breakpoint between 4 and 3 is really really important.
Yeah, and that's uncommon. I mean, that's kind of
Yeah.
a what would you call them? The kind of that mid tier monster range, right? The hippogriff, the
Mm-hmm.
griffin, the manicore. There are others that are kind of in
The
that mid
Wyvern.
tier monster range. The whip, that's another great one, great example. The abyssal terror on the vampires and such. So there's quite a few of them out there, and getting barding on them for a better armor save that is not common.
Yeah, so I think that some players, even in the competitive scene, do take a Hippogriff for a Baron to help kind of buff up their wounds because they go from 3 to 6. And
hmm
then if you're going to have a Baron with a toughness 5 monster mount that you're riding, and you have a Virtue, that's pretty scary. Whereas with the Royal Pegasus, they'd only be on 4 wounds, and that's something
Well,
that
speaking
can
of scary,
go down
doesn't it
to.
give you terror too?
Yes, it does give you terror. So it,
So that's
it
one way to get it in the list if that's
yeah,
something you are interested in having as an option. Yeah.
yeah. I think basically the one of the reasons why we see the Royal Pegasus so much is, for one, the model is gorgeous. So we have this brand new model, and everyone's going to
So
have
good.
it because it's in your starter set. So every starter set that's being bought is now has a Royal Pegasus in it, right?
So awesome.
Yeah, and then you can join your other Pegasus Knights units with this upgraded, better version of the Pegasus, right? You can have a Pegasus for 30 points, but why would you ever do that when the Royal Pegasus is very marginally, not that many more points, and gives you the 2 stomp attacks, and the extra wound and the toughness, right?
Yeah. Well,
So
really, I think the biggest reason why the Pegasus are so Pegasi are so powerful right now, whether you have a character on it, whether it's the unit that on it, it's not that the stats inherently are broken or super
mhm.
overpowered, but it's that they're in skirmish formation and that they're able to see and charge 360. That right there, I believe, is the reason why they are so powerful as a
Yeah,
unit, and why they're so strong, because if you can move that fast and you have a 360 and they have switch trade, right? um, it makes they're one of, if the most, if not the fastest thing in the game to go chase things down with a decent stat line. So that's the biggest difference. If you put them on a hippogriff right now, you're on a larger monster and you have that frontal arc like a dragon or a griffin or anything else. But if you stay on that pegasus, you have this incredible flexibility, and you don't have to just be solo because you can put it with a unit
yeah,
of Pegasus. And that's one thing that other armies really don't have, is when you have that your character on, let's say, a small size monstrous cavalry thing, even if it flies, it's rare to be able to combine him with a full unit to protect him, to get him into combat, and to be able to go 360. That's
Yeah.
really what, in my opinion, pushes it over the edge as one of the strongest combos in the game.
Yeah, and you can also bring a banner on these Pegasus Knights who can then help
Good point.
support the character when the character does most of the fighting. So I mean, there's a that's essentially just a combo that is of the same power level as a dragon, but it's more mobile, right?
Hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah, and mobility is huge. In
yeah,
particular, in almost every tabletop game, movement is king. In old world, it is especially true.
yeah.
The movement phase and what you do with moving and positioning your army is so powerful, and absolutely wins and loses games very quickly in the old world.
And
Yep.
I think that the thing that the 360 charge is giving you, it's also that you can be very like you can make a lot of mistakes because this will just catch
Hmm.
you and say no, it's fine, you're good, keep going. When a lot of other armies, they will position and they'll take a lot of time to put their dragon at a very specific angle and say, okay, now it's your turn. And then the person just moves right out of the arc, and you're like, oh, crud, I didn't realize you were going to do that. Right?
Hmm.
Where with Pegasus Knights and Pegasus characters, you can just be like, I'm just going to land here. You figure it out. Because your threat range isn't a cone, it's a circle. That
Yep.
is
It's
a
huge.
lot harder to move out of. So if you move these Pegasus Knights with the character in it to the middle of the table, there's now a 40-inch bubble in all, 40-inch diameter bubble of I will kill you, right?
Yeah, and I think also in particular, most events you're going to go to don't have as much terrain. This isn't as powerful in particular at our events, at our Old World Legend events, because we love terrain. We put a lot of time and effort and energy to have beautiful tables with lots of terrain, forests, impassable, so forth, things that block line of sight. But again, a lot of the player base out there have more open tables. In particular, if you go off the core rulebook where it says has this big opening in the center of the table with no terrain, it's very easy to just plop in the center, as everyone was saying, and just have this huge control of the board, a threat range of the whole board, which can be very you. It shifts the meta and what other players have to build towards. They no longer can say, "I will outmaneuver this person because I'm a skilled player." I have to absorb the charge, and you start building strategies on the other side of the fence of, okay, the Pegasus unit's going to charge me. I can't stop it. So what do I need to do to build my army so that I can handle and absorb that charge and counterpunch it correctly, right? So that's definitely
Yeah.
affecting quite a bit of how the meta is shaped today.
Yeah, and I think that that's also where we see that there's such a predominant focus on basically making that side of the army as strong as possible, potentially to the detriment of the wizards. So you bring the prophetess to help having that dispel power. A lot of times people will bring the that one item that helps you dispel hexes easier. Um,
Hmm.
but a prophetess can ride a royal Pegasus, and a prophetess could join Pegasus Knights and then cast spells to make them even stronger. But you often don't
Hmm.
see this because people want to spend all their points on making the fighting characters even better. So perhaps you can help. You can spend your points differently and play to your heart's content, because with most other armies they need some kind of spell casting to make their strongest units at the same level, right?
Yep.
Um,
Yep.
yeah. So I think that's
Well, we're
something
seeing
that
counters to it.
yeah,
That is happening. We're seeing counter. We're seeing, dwarf blocks. We're seeing dragon blocks, vampire blocks, Tomb King blocks. We're definitely seeing people are learning how to build things in order to counter this, but it's still very
yeah.
strong.
Essentially, Pegasus
But
Knights
fun
are
to play too.
amazing. Yeah, essentially they're amazing versus the MSU build. So if you bring,
Yes.
5, 10 units that are between 100 and 300 points, Pegasus Knights will just pick up 5 of those in a game, and you'll win. You'll lose by 1,000 points. So what people
Hmm.
do instead is they bring, much bigger units that are more invested in being defensive and being able to survive, so that those Pegasus Knights don't just bring, you know, like when you're playing. We'll get into this in our other tactics videos, but when you're playing, how can you bring 800 points of your army against 200 points of theirs? Because almost nothing that's 200 points will survive versus 800 points hitting you, right? And
Yep.
so Pegasus Knights gives you the answer. You just outmaneuver them, right? And so the answer that a lot of people respond with is, okay, the only thing to fight is this 800 point thing. So now how are you going to bring 800 of your points against 200 of mine if all my stuff's in one spot?
All right,
Right?
so I think we talked about the Pegasus and the benefits that they
Yeah,
bring, and also some of the counters and interesting stuff that's going on in the meta. But there's also, right, your classic Bretonnia Warhorse and normal Warhorse, pretty straightforward. But they also have a unicorn. So tell us what's interesting about the unicorn, Evan.
Yeah, so what's interesting about the unicorn, I really like this beguiling aura. I think vampire counts spend more points to buy this than how much a unicorn costs. So you have to take a leadership test before trying to hit the person, and if you fail that leadership test, only rolls of 6 will hit. Um,
Hmm.
that can be spicy, especially if you're, dealing with someone who's outside their general's range and it's a goblin with leadership 6, right? So
Hmm.
sometimes, your character. In fact, I played a game where Elise Duchard, who's essentially just a prophetess riding a unicorn with higher
Hmm.
toughness, kicked and murdered my Empire captain on Demogryph to death after he failed to kill her. So, yeah,
Bummer.
unicorn is no joke. I think it's a
Yeah.
perfectly great mount, and it's a movement
And for
10.
35 points, really, really cost effective for the profile it brings you.
Yeah, and with the lance formation, you're allowed to be on a unicorn and join your regular knights and just sit pretty much just wherever you want. The book goes into a lot of detail about exactly how you're allowed to just have it all. Go for it,
Yeah, despite being on the larger base.
Yeah.
So it still lets you mix your lance formation with unicorns. And the models look awesome
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah.
Who doesn't want a unicorn? They're super cool.
And they also have the counter charge. So if you are running around solo and a couple of war dogs or elven cavalry charge you, you can be like, you know what, watch this, and then just charge them back. If you have a assailant spell, now you're winning this fight, right?
Oh, for sure. All right. Anything else for mounts?
No.
Moving on. All right. Knights of the Realm on foot. So tell us about those, Evan.
Yeah, so basically, as we were going through in the army list, and the army list here, they're not broken down by core, special, rare. They're broken down by essentially unit types. So here we're going through all the infantry first, and then all the cavalry, and then on the monsters, things like that. So you had to have one unit of Knights of the Realm either on foot or mounted. And what's really cool about these guys is that they have Furious Charge, and that they're going to have that Blessing of the Lady. So you can just have infantry models who can bring that heavy armor, and if they charge, they're going to have an extra attack, and
Mm-hmm.
they have a ward save. That is pretty durable. I think a lot of people would benefit from playing them in objective based scenarios where you need some kind of ranks or banners, for example, to capture points. However,
Mm-hmm.
when the Bretonnian army is so fast and its signature move is to just run right at you, a lot of these kind of units often just get left behind. So it's not so much that they aren't strong, it's just that you would have to build your whole army around basically bringing them to the battlefield, right? And you don't
Yep.
have access to, for example, Steed of Shadows to make them fly 24 inches. So the best you could do probably here is basically move 8 and then Arc and Urgency 8 more. That would be how you can help
Yeah.
get these
So
guys.
they're not as fast.
Yeah,
But for 11 points,
yeah,
a decent stat line, weapon skill 4, and the Blessing of the Lady, and Furious Charge, and the Knight's Vow, that's a steal for
yeah.
11 points with heavy armor and a shield. You don't have to pay for that extra. That's fantastic.
Yeah, and pretty much what most people will do is they'll take the great weapons in addition to the shields, and then they'll just have
Hmm.
a pretty good bunker. Now this is also a good place for you to put your prophetess, for example, and then just bring up a unit that can just sit there and actually tank some damage. I think
Hmm.
Knights of the Realm who are mounted are very good at reaching out and threatening medium-sized units. But as we are seeing a move towards the bigger, more Death Star-like blocks, I don't know if 10 Knights of the Realm with their lances, with their only one attempt to basically get those lance attacks in there, is going to cut it compared to like a long grind against 90 skeletons, right?
Yeah, or even just other things, right? Like a basic Knights of the Realm, right? If they charge something really deadly, like a Chosen Knight unit or a Blood Knight unit, right? They whiff a few of their attacks, they're in trouble real quick, right? So it just you need the right tool for the right job, and I think we're going to see more Knights of the Realm on foot in the future.
Yeah.
I do believe we're going to see some additional benefits that are going to both from either scenarios and or balance updates and things. And I think we're going to definitely see these a lot on the table a lot more, which is great because I think the models are awesome, and I'd love to see more of them out there.
Yeah. So we have both the squires and the peasant bowmen, who are essentially, they've got the bliss skill 3, they got a longbow, and the main difference is that squires can bring a lot of cool special rules. They can skirmish, vanguard, fire and flee, have the scouts rule. That's useful in a lot of armies. Scouts being able to be deployed and capture, some kind of point or an interesting, terrain piece, or to just block out other people from moving to certain spots can be
Mm-hmm.
really useful. Most people tend to not bring them because, especially with the latest FAQ, if you have any scout units, then you didn't finish deploying until they're all the way down. And with Bretonnia, you don't worry about that because you're always going to be praying pretty much anyway, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think the thing though is that every unit that's not a core unit is Pegasus Knights points, right? So how are you going to bring squires if even 5 of them is going to be 1 or 2 Pegasus Knights that you don't have now? So
Yeah, but just having a handful of these units that can skirmish in Vanguard is so powerful. Just being able to skirmish, even if they're going to sacrificial units, just get in the way to those early roadblocks or those early redirectors or those things to slow down or control the enemy, or to set up your charges for turn two, turn three. They're very points effective at doing that, and it's definitely worth taking some of them.
yeah, they help support other infantry units a lot. In particular, having fire and flee, I know from my time playing Empire that if you have some archers with fire and flee, you can set them up so that, okay, you're going to have to charge the archers. I will use fire and flee so that I only flee d6 inches, and I'll make
Yep.
sure that they basically just are going to get killed. They're going to get caught by the enemy. But then, when people catch your unit that fled, they stop moving. They can reform, but they can't overrun. And what's really useful about that is that now you know where they're going to be. They're going to be within d6 of wherever that archer unit started, and this can help set up your Knights of the Realm on foot to make their charge with their Furious Charge, for example.
Hmm.
Yeah, but you don't have to try that hard if you just have Pegasus Knights who can fly around, right? So it's just a tomato type play.
Yeah, but again, I think we'll see more of them in the future, and they are very effective.
Yeah, Men at Arms are interesting. They're goblins who happen to be human.
Hmm. Cheap, 4 points.
Yeah,
That's a really low cost. Hmm.
yeah, and being able to just take like the pole arms where they count as being either spears or halberds, you get to just pick essentially.
Hmm.
That's pretty cool. And having two different champions is great for being able to absorb different challenges and things of that nature. And then they're cheap, and you can just bring a lot of these guys. And like we were saying earlier, with the knight special rule, not only can the knights help provide their leadership to the peasant units, when the
Hmm.
peasants flee, the knights don't care as much about it,
Hmm.
right? That's great.
Yeah, and again, for 4 points, you need a unit size of 10. It's not always about every unit needs to be a killer unit, or every unit needs to be an anvil unit that could absorb a charge. Just spending 40 points to get in the way or to take up space on the board, or to slow down the enemy or redirect the charge. That's a great investment in points to be able to do that. So, right, not everything is going to be what punches through and destroys the enemy force. You're going to see a lot of the top tier tables, top tier players. You're going to be see they will have these low points, these very cost efficient units that they knowingly are going to sacrifice in order to combo queue up, right? They're queuing up their counter charges and getting you in position so that their powerful units are hitting the right things at the right time.
And then, as we were saying earlier, so you have that one plus of either men at arms or peasant bowmen. So the peasant bowmen are very similar to the men at arms, except they have better leadership. I don't understand this. I guess maybe it's
Well, if
just
I had a
because
bow, I would feel, more
I
confident.
guess because they're not expected to have to walk into get stabbed. I don't know,
Yeah. Hmm.
but yeah, every time someone passes their peasant bowman panic check on a leadership 7 roll, I'm like, why are they leadership 7?
Yeah,
But
and again, they're not the most powerful unit. Their ballistic skill is 3 though; it's not 2, which is great. And again, they're not going to be taking down enemy dragons or really armored other things. But again, just a handful, very few points. 10 of them for 50 points. A few
yeah,
pot shots at the other armies, right? Their skirmishing units, their fast cavalry units, their MSU light units that are getting in the way of your army. This is one of your tools that again you plink off 1, 2, 3 wounds from those things. It definitely reduce because they're typically MSU. There's typically only 4 or 5 wide of these things. It can create holes and gaps and opportunities for your knights to get through things. So it's definitely great having some of them on hand. Just be aware what their use is for.
yeah, and any of the units can be skirmishers if you so choose.
Hmm. Which is great. A lot of
Yeah.
flexibility there.
Yeah, so battle pilgrims, these are particularly an odd unit. Now you can take them as core units in the Errantry Crusade, which is interesting, but they have some odd rules. They're kind of like a flagellant for the Empire, where they're kind of these crazed zealots, and if you bring the Reliquary and they're near Grail Knight units, or basically units with the Grail Vow, they can then become unbreakable instead of just being stubborn. So they're very good at just like holding the line, for
Hmm.
a guy
Hmm.
who's weapon skill 2. And then they have hatred, all enemies, which they're gonna need because they're only weapon skill 2, so they're gonna have a hard time hitting things, right? But what you use these guys for is to block up. Let's just say there was an objective of some kind. These guys would be pretty good at just sitting on it and being like, "What are you gonna do?" Right?
Hmm.
Yeah.
Hmm. Yep, and that I think that's the purpose, and they're really cool models. So,
Yeah,
again, hope to see more of those in the future.
yeah. Now, okay, so now we're into the cavalry. So the two main core cavalry units are the Mounted Knights of the Realm. So remember your 1+. So this is possibly the one that you know
Hmm.
very often go with. Um, these guys are what I like to call medium cavalry because they're only going to be a 3+ armor save. Guy who starts with strength 3. So even with the lance, he's only going to be strength 5, not strength 6, like a Blood Knight or a Chaos Knight, for
Hmm.
example.
Hmm.
But a very competitive price point and with the ward save. So these units are worth investing in as either small units that run around and pick up other small units, or as kind
Hmm.
of like a character bunker that moves forward and provides support with just weight of attacks. For example, in the Bretonnian Exiles, if they get an outcast wizard casting dark magic on them, they become truly scary, very horrifying.
Yep,
Or like
but
I
they
said
can
earlier,
also
yeah, go for it.
they can chase down war machines, right? Again, movement 8 is
Okay,
great.
I have to interrupt you, okay? Because I had an Empire Great Cannon crew, okay? And you see, this Great Cannon crew was facing off against five Knights of the Realm, and on the previous turn we had I think Outriders had shot down to have only the champion was left, just that unit
Bummer.
champion of
Ooh,
the Mounts of the Realm, and so
okay.
the unit champion charges the Great Cannon. And yeah, I said, you know what, I'm gonna hold. We'll see what happens. And my Great Cannon crew killed this Knights of the Realm champion. So explain that, Mike. Explain that. And then we had to look up
Well,
whether war machines were allowed to overrun when they won, and apparently
well,
they are. They
first
are
of
not.
all, you should start with rolling better. But besides
No, Ag was
that,
rolling great. What are we talking about?
the fact that those outriders were shooting your Knights of the Realm and not a more important unit was also a good thing right there, because that means they were absorbing shots for something you probably didn't want to get shot. So it's all relative. So again, you have to pick and choose. Running after War Machine into the reach of a whole bunch of other guns, maybe not the best strategy. Maybe they should have held back and focused on board control there. But not
Mm-hmm.
every army is going to have a whole bunch of other guns, right? Just depends on what army you're facing against. Other thing to keep in mind for those medium units, they are also good for just shooting up the board and getting on turn 2, turn 3, flank and rear support charges with other units, those combined charges, to get that additional combat resolution for getting in the flank or the rear of the enemy. You will have to be a larger unit size, in order to break their ranks, but you only need one model in order to get the +1 or +2 for that flank or the rear charge. So multiple things that the medium cavalry unit can do. But as Evan said, screaming across the board, think you're going to take on that big, powerful, brick of the, dwarven brick or chaos chosen knights. That's not what this unit is for. This is a medium unit, and you need to make sure you're using it for its intended purpose.
Yep. They make a very good home for your prophetess to hang out with for
Mm-hmm.
sure.
Good bunker. Yep.
So questing knights, they're awkward. So the it's when you look at the points, you're like, okay, so we got weapon skill 5 and strength 4, and only like 2 more points than a Knights of the Realm.
Mm-hmm.
So what's the problem, right? I mean, and the problem is that you have a great weapon and you lost countercharge. So the questing knights are almost always going to be fighting second. So if some other cavalry fights them, they have to now fight second. And then they don't have, 2 attacks or anything. So if they lose 3 models and they only had 3 left, now you only have like 4 attacks back, right? Um, the other thing that's a bit of a downside, and I know this also from playing Empire Knights who have great weapons as well, is that if you just have heavy armor and barding and you have to use two-handed weapon, now you just have a 4+ armor save, which very
Mm-hmm.
quickly isn't very much, right? So I think that a lot of the units in the Bretonnian army are good and can be used quite usefully. I think just having a guys who are up skill 5, strength 4 with the blessing of the lady, that's great. But most people don't invest putting characters in there to make these guys work because they're too busy
Mm-hmm.
putting their characters on something that flies, right?
Yeah, for now.
Yeah.
But we'll see in the future. And I think to your point, this is still a lot of people see that great weapon, and they again want to go towards it's a frontline unit. It's still not a frontline unit. This is still I'd still classify this as a medium. It's on the heavier side of a medium unit, but I still classify it as a medium unit. To your point, the biggest benefit of that great sword versus the lance, it's not the first round of combat. In the first round of combat, the lance is the superior weapon, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because you get all the benefits. But it's when you have to go round 2, round 3, etc., that you get none of the benefits of the lance because you only got it on the charge, but you still get the benefit of that great weapon. That's when it's really going to start to shine, because that's a big thing about all the lance units of the Bretonnian army, or any army that has lances. Really powerful on the impact, after that, if they didn't break or make the enemy flee or wipe them out, and they're stuck in a war of attrition, they're going to have a lot of problems on the next turn because they drop down to their strength 3 or strength 4, and they don't have the armor piercing benefit of the lance. And so this is where the great weapon starts to shine in those things. But again, to your Evan's point, they don't have a ton of armor. They are a medium unit. So if you're round 2 or 3 in the front, and the enemy is able to bring a ton of attacks against you, and they're
Yeah.
going to typically strike first because you have that lower initiative, the great weapon, they will tear you down by your less armor save. But again, if you can get a block of these, or even small of them, in the flank or the rear of the enemy, in particular the flank, where generally speaking they're going to have far fewer attacks that they can direct against you, that's when they can potentially shine. But that is more work and more effort to pull that combo off at this point in time.
I think that these guys excel versus something like a chariot or a medium level monster because of their higher strength
Mm-hmm.
and their AP2 great weapons. So if they're going to
Yeah.
get a charge off versus something of that nature, they can just outfight it. And then if they do lose, they have stubborn. I think the main issue we see is essentially just in the army construction step, which is that if you could have a questing knight as a core unit, you could then afford to bring 350 points of questing knights, right?
Yeah.
Because that would be coming out of a slot that is available for those kind of units. But instead, these guys compete against the slot that is your Pegasus Knights points. And once we see how
Yep.
much they cost, you'll see why you end up spending 250 points or 500 points of your army essentially just on that.
So it's not that it's not a good unit; it's just that it's competing in a slot with something else that
Yeah.
people are gonna is currently better.
I personally would have loved to see 0 to 1 questing knights as a core unit in the Errantry Crusade, to kind of bring alongside. I think that would make sense for their lore as well. So maybe we'll see other armies of infamy in the future.
Yeah, I definitely could see that in the future. We've definitely seen other versions in older editions where they had a lot of questing knight themes, a
Yeah,
whole armies based around the questing knight theme. So I'd love to, just as we talked about peasant theme, questing knight theme. So I think that's very very high contender for the future.
yeah. So Grail Knights, yeah. So we have
Woo,
a regular unit that has weapon skill 6. I think that is unheard
that's
of
high.
outside of Sword Masters of Hoeth. So that is interesting because a lot of lords out there are weapon skill 7, the strongest ones are,
Mm-hmm.
but the lords who are weapon skill 6, they're not going to be hitting these guys on a 3. And when every single one of these guys can challenge, that's interesting. It can help
Yeah.
prevent them from taking a lot of overkill damage in a challenge, for example, and be able to fight on their own.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the thing that holds the Grail Knight back is that they don't have a 5-point upgrade to buy full plate armor that like a lot of the other heaviest cavalry in the game does have.
Mm-hmm.
And like we said, rare slots also compete with the special slot if you're going to be taking 1,000 points of characters, right? So if you take 1,000 points of characters, 500 points of core, what's the rest of it going to be? Well, rare and special now it's the same allotment, right? And
Yeah.
so how are you going to bring Grail Knight when every single one you bring is some number of peg knights that you're not bringing? And so I think these guys are awesome. Like that's just want to say that. And once
They
you put
are.
the
They're
banner on
really
them,
good.
yeah, you can put the banner on them, and then I think almost required is you got to bring the lady's gift spell to give them the regen save to help give them armor, ward, and regen to just stay alive. That starts to make these guys very interesting and exciting. And then once you can take this Grail Guardian and basically make him another paladin because he's got the 50 points of magic items.
Yeah, I ran
Yeah,
into that where I played a game and somebody had that upgraded guy and just gave him some defensive magic items, not a ton of them. And I was stuck in combat with him for a long time because the stat line is a lot better than you think. I think you're exactly right, Evan. That, and they are, I believe, priced competitively for their potential output. It's that they're one wound, which is again always the challenge with the elite cavalry in the game. Whether those are chosen Chaos Knights or Grail Knights or Blood Knights, one of their biggest weaknesses is the one wound. Now, Blood Knights can res, the other armies can't, but at least the chosen still get that full plate as the Blood Knights, and the Grail Knights are one wound. They don't get the res, and they don't get the full plate. They do
right.
get the ward saves though, and the potential other combos, and those are great. Don't get me wrong, but that dice bracket of going from that 3+ to the 2+ is fairly significant. Not so much for when heavy weapons are hitting you, because typically the heavier stuff are other melee units, but when you're getting plinked away by smaller bowmen or archers or goblins or things like that, where they just throw a lot of shots at you, and it's like they're not very effective. But when you're like, hey, roll 5 dice, you're going to roll some ones and twos,
Mm-hmm.
and it's going to make them drop. So I think that's really why we don't see them as much as we would compared to some of the other elite knights in the game.
Yeah. Although they're a lot easier to rank up than Pegasus Knights, I'll tell you that much.
And they're beautiful. They're so cool.
So Pegasus Knights. So this is the
I feel
monstrous
we've already
cavalry.
talked about this for
Yeah, we
quite a
have.
while.
Yeah. So I just want to point out the combination that's strong is first of all, because you're weapon skill 4, that's basically all you need for defense. Because someone would have to be weapon skill 9 to hit you on a 2. And someone,
Very rare.
And so it's really the weapon skill 3 people who are suffering in defensively. So 4 is kind of a bare minimum for a melee unit. They get to be strength 4. I'm not sure what gym they go to, but I want a subscription because these guys aren't even questing knights yet and they have strength 4. Crazy.
They just pump iron all day. Yeah,
Yeah.
they're great.
They also, you combine that with both having essentially skirmisher, which we already talked about, furious charge and counter charge, and the furious charge working while you do a counter charge means you can just put these guys basically wherever you want, and then you'll be like, oh, you're gonna charge me? Okay, I'll counter charge, and now all my guys have 2 attacks.
Yep.
A lot of things cannot handle that, and every time I play against Pegasus Knights, I constantly am going, okay, I'm not gonna charge you because I don't want to eat the counter charge, so I don't want that to happen in my turn. So I have to deal with this. It's a problem unit to deal with. And I think the other reason why you see Pegasus Knights mostly in the 2 units in the same army is now you have 2 problems to solve. Whenever someone only brings a single unit of Pegasus Knights against me, I can help or organize my units to focus the things that can handle them separately. When there's 2 of them in my face, their sacrifices have to be made. Not every unit can handle trying to deal with them, outmaneuver them.
Yep. I think that's what you saw definitely Bretonnia at the top meta for a while, and they're still very strong in the meta. But definitely people are starting to shift and adapt and build units and things that can handle them. But we've talked about them quite a bit
Yeah.
already. Anything else to talk about them anymore? Should we move
No.
on?
Yeah, so Mounted Yeomen are another unit that make elf players very jealous because having Feigned Flight on your light cavalry is amazing.
So good.
Oh, that's frustrating because you can basically just put these guys out there and say, they're in the way. And I can fire and flee. So if I need to not flee very far, if I'm close to the board edge, you use fire and flee to help not flee off the board, right? And then Feigned Flight, you automatically rally, so there's no concern about having to, pass a leadership 6 rally test. You're good.
Mm-hmm.
You're good to go.
Yep. Super great utility unit. And again, I'd encourage everybody to at least take one of them in your list, if not 2, and really get a lot of reps in, learn how to play this unit. It is a great utility piece, one of the best ones the army has, and you will learn to really help you control the battlefield and deal with some of the slow down your opponent and deal with some of the problematic units in some very clever ways.
The other way to do it is basically to take the Mounted Yeoman to put your prophetess in. You put her on the warhorse, you join them, they're skirmishers, they've got Feigned Flight, so now you can flee whenever anyone tries to charge you and you automatically rally, which means now the wizard can still dispel. If you're in any other type of fast cavalry unit and you have to flee, now the wizard is fleeing, so they can't be dispelling for the rest of that turn. With Feigned Flight, nope, I'm still dispelling. And Reserve Move. Reserve Move gets carried over to the wizard. And so now this whole unit can move up, cast spells, move away. That is frustrating.
Well, great for the Bretonnia player.
Absolutely.
Sure.
Basically,
and the main reason, right, they're trying to mess with people's ranges, right?
Yeah.
They want to get just within range to cast their spell, ideally outside of the dispel range of your caster, right? And then move back out so that they're forcing the opponent's caster to keep moving forward, which is exactly what the Bretonnia player wants you to do, is come to them.
You can also just use Reserve Move to keep up with the rest of the army. You can move forward, cast the spell that you wouldn't be able to cast if you had to march, and then Reserve Move to move the rest of the way. So you can move up, fireball, move forward again.
Yep.
So we talked about the mounts already. The Hippogriff is interesting, gives you a couple of wounds. I generally see this with the Baron to make them essentially a medium fighty character. That's the only monster. Wow, we're done. Field Trebuchet.
It's good.
Yeah. So it's a catapult, right? It does catapult things, except it's strength 5.
Yeah, and it's a cool model. And it's very effective. So definitely, right, there are some people who prefer to have their army without ranged weapons, and that's definitely a fun thematic choice and a way to build a build. But definitely having some of these can be very useful. Again, even if you can plunk one wound off a dragon or take down maybe one of those elite soldiers of the enemy army, again, you're not taking catapults and trebuchets to wipe out units. That's in the current edition. That's not what they're there. They're there to weaken things or to interact and hit things that are hiding behind stuff. That's what they're effective at. But again, they're not going to be wiping out whole bricks and things, and it's rarely effective. It's harder to hit those small MSU units. So it's really looking for those elite enemy forces or those things that are out of range or just maneuvering too far and plinking a few wounds off of them so that when you do eventually clash into combat with them, they're easier to deal with.
Yeah, it's also pretty unique that it's a toughness 7 war machine. A lot of war
Mm-hmm.
machines, like Empire cannons, are toughness 6. That makes it a lot harder to be wounded by, you know, shooting, because most shooting isn't
Yep.
strong enough to wound
Yeah,
that.
it's a great point.
So I think we alluded to this earlier, but the virtues are one of the things that makes your melee characters very, very strong. And what do you know? The first two on the list are essentially the main ones that people will play because they're so
That's cool.
very strong, right?
So let's not go through all of them. Let's just go
Yeah.
through some of the best ones.
Yeah, so the best one is the Virtue of Knightly Temper, which in the turn in which you charged, this model gains extra attacks plus D3 and hatred. Now, whatever supermarket they went to and got that, I want to go to because that's amazing.
It's 70 points. It's a lot of points, but
Mm-hmm.
it's very effective. In particular, hatred of all enemies. Hatred allows you to re-roll your attacks
Mm-hmm.
in that first round of combat, and that's re-rolls in the old world are rare. Rare to come by, so it's very, very powerful. In order to have that, it just create when you only have 4 or 5 attacks, making it so you get a 90% hit rate versus a smaller, a 70 or 60 percentage makes a huge difference, especially in the game that can be very swingy. So, very, very powerful to have that
Yeah,
plus the additional attacks. It's a great combo.
versus a high weapon skill enemy character or one that has minuses to hit, this doubles your
Mm-hmm.
damage. Because if you had to hit them on a 5 plus because of, like, let's say they're the wood elf character with, multiple ways to lower your weapon skill or your -1 to hit, if you can have hatred and extra attacks, you probably do twice as much damage as if you didn't have those things.
Yeah. So even though it's expensive, you're going to see this a lot.
Yeah, and I think just it's the simple math is that if you spend points on the same model to buy them an ogre blade, to buy them virtual knightly temper, and to put it on the duke who already has 5 attacks, if you keep tripling down on that one thing, you make that one thing very strong.
Mm-hmm.
Then the other one that is a lot of fun and a little bit more random, that's kind of one of the reasons why it's perhaps kind of the second choice, is the virtue of heroism, which gives basically that character the killing blow and monster slayer. And as long as they have, basically a
Say that
non-magic
again.
weapon,
It
right?
gives them killing blow and
Yeah,
monster slayer because
yeah,
almost everything else in the game is you may have one or you may have the other. This thing gets both. Why is it so powerful, Evan?
yeah. So I mean, I think it's powerful because it first of all it creates a threat projection of you could lose all 9 wounds of your dragon in one go, and it could be
Mm-hmm.
on the first round of combat before that thing even gets to fight. So it creates a threat
Happens
range.
more often than you think.
Yeah, it creates a threat range of that. It has to use. I mean, so it doesn't have the Knightly Temper, so it's only going to have 5 attacks on the Duke, 4 attacks on the Baron, but you only need 1/6, right? And most things in the game only have a 5+ ward save against that. So if you rolled a 6, you now have a 2/3 chance of killing that thing completely, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think this is good. This is often essentially seen on the second character. So a Baron, for example, will take this, and they'll bring a lance and a shield, so it's nice and cheap. So this might be 60 points, but it's almost like taking this instead of a magic weapon. So you do this, and then you don't need a weapon.
Yep, because they're going to go monster hunting.
Yeah.
But also, besides monster hunting, you're not always going to fight an opponent that has a character on a dragon or a big monster. And the fact that it also has killing blow, so it can go kill those monstrous infantry or those elite cavalry or those guys on foot. Same thing. It's very rare to get both. I'm not going to say there isn't another way to do it, but I can't think of one off the top of my head. So it's amazing. The only thing you can't killing blow at that point is basically chariots. For the most part, you can killing blow.
Yeah, or a
Everything
dwarf.
else can kill.
Dwarf characters who have rune of protection that prevents killing blow from happening.
Well, there's always exceptions to every
Yeah.
rule in the old world. That's
Yeah.
for sure. Any other standouts on the list for you?
So I'm a huge fan of Virtue of the Ideal. It can make your Baron turn into a second Duke. So if you take a
Okay.
Baron, you put him on a Hippogriff, you give him Virtue of the Ideal. He now has the weapon skill 7. The initiative of the Duke. He's got then he has the 5 attacks of the Duke. So you don't have the killing blow and Monster Slayer, but you have basically Duke 2.
Mm-hmm.
The sequel.
2.0.
Yeah, And then the only downside is they can't join a unit or be the general. But if you're the Baron and you're on a Hippogriff, you're not going to do either of those things. So you're good.
Cool. So definitely a lot of good combos here, and those are the ones you said, Evan. You can only take one of, right? And you
Yeah.
can't double down on them.
Yes, you can only take one. Some of the characters or some of the unit champions can take these as well. So sometimes you'll see some of these on,
Nice.
for example, the Paladins or the Grail Knight champions can sometimes take these.
Cool. All right, let's move on.
So we have magic weapon slots. To be honest, you don't see a lot of the magic weapons, and you don't see a lot of the of these other items. There are a couple standout items that are very very good, and they're almost in every essentially army list. So
Which ones?
yeah, so first we have Grommel Greathelm. So the fact that you have an item that just gives you one higher armor without using your regular armor or your barding or any other kind of slot means that everyone who takes this is going to be on a 2+ save now because they went from the 3+ with the Barded Hippogriff or the the Royal Pegasus Heavy Armor Shield to now they're on a 2+. That is doubling your chance of not getting hurt by something without AP, right? So that's great.
Mm-hmm.
And it gives you reroll ones, so it's actually doing far more than that, right?
Yeah, very very good item. You're going to see it in pretty much every list.
It's pretty common along the guy who has the virtue of heroism because the heroism guy has to take a non-magic weapon, so he doesn't have any.
Yep.
He's not going to be spending any on the magic weapon, so he'll take the Grommel Greathelm instead, and then something else.
All right, what else?
So the next thing we see a lot is the Serena's Locket. So scroll down. So Serena's Locket gives the model immune to multiple wounds. Now we're in a meta right now that prefers to have consistency, and Killing Blow, Monster Slayer. These aren't as consistent as just every time I do a hit, it multiplies into a couple hits, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's no dragon in the game that gets to ignore multiple wounds, so that's something pretty useful to bring when you have to eat through 9 wounds of a character, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you get to just be like, okay, for 25 points, I'm immune to that. And it's a talisman, but I don't have to go and buy Talisman of Protection or any other kind of ward save. So I don't have to take this instead of that. I have it on top of my ward save. So I've got a ward save,
Yeah.
and if you bring an Overblade, or if you're the Dwarf King with the D6 wounds, Rune of Smiting, nope, you're not. I just take 1. You just spent
very powerful.
You just spent 70 to like 90 points giving your character multiple wounds of damage, and this guy ignores it.
But of course, it's contextual, as you said, and a lot of armies don't have any multiple wound weapons in their list at all. So, right, it might be incredibly effective versus your opponent you're facing, and in some games it might not be applicable at all.
Which is why the fact that it's only 25 points means just
Not
throw it
so
in
bad.
there. Why not?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we often see Banner of Shalons here on a unit, for example, of like Knights of the Realm, and just being able to, or on Pegasus Knights, to be able to say to like a unit of 20 Iron Drakes, you don't get to stand and shoot. That's worth 20 points because they were going to kill more than one knight with that stand and shoot. So you put that on your unit and you become even more oppressive. You say you're not allowed to do stuff.
Yep.
So I think I've complained about this before, but I think the Falconhorn item in the enchanted items list, especially because you have so many unit champions or characters who don't need their slots taken up by ward save items, right? You can just bring this, and it is meta defining. That if you get to just pass your leadership test, the whole other faction doesn't get to fly, but you still do. So you don't have to sacrifice anything. It's not that your units don't get to fly. It's just them that doesn't get to fly, and that drops a dragon's movement from 10 to 6, and drops their charge range from 19 to 15. That's a problem.
It's huge.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it also
it's super,
really
super
neuters
powerful.
units that don't have high movement but they have fly, like Fellbats moving 2 inches now, or 1 inch, right?
It's really short. So yeah, it's definitely very very effective. I mean, and typically it will be on somebody who has a decent leadership, so they're going to pass it most of the time. I have played a game for somebody who literally failed this 3 or 4 times in a row, and I was so funny. I was laughing. We were both. At a certain point we were like both laughing at it because it was just so ridiculous. But we're pretty sure the knights around that character were laughing at their lord for failing that. But besides that, it is again fairly reliable because this army has very decent leadership. And it is a very powerful item, and it can completely skew over army lists that are invested very heavily in flyers.
Yeah.
which typically dragons are something you're seeing a lot of still, and will continue to see because dragons are awesome, and so everybody wants them. So it can very much hugely impact those lists, and so they need to start thinking of ways and how to deal with it. Like, okay, if I don't have my flyer, how am I going to chase down this character or find or deal with this character that's causing this, when typically they're going to be in the back, because there's not a range on this and such. So very powerful item. Definitely, I think something that should be in the crosshairs in the future for balance consideration. Honestly, I think if the item itself just had a range, it would be 18 inches, 24 inches, something like that. It would be very reasonably balanced at that point. But I am just speculating at this point. That's just my opinion. We'll see if GW and the team decides to address this in the future or not. But it's a very powerful item. Definitely one of the most powerful ones in the game. That's for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah, so I think that you often see a prophetess taking prayer icon of Canel's, and one of the main reasons why is it decreases your dispel range. That's really huge, especially if
Great.
your range is further than the other person's, so you can stay within dispelling them, but they can't dispel you. That's
Mm-hmm.
big.
Mm-hmm.
And if your unit has a reserve move, that'll be a lot easier to do.
Even better. Cool. All right, so we talked about some of the highlights of some of the items.
Yeah.
The special rules. I think you've already taken us through the blessing already, and what have we? The lance formation. So it is we're talking about the lance a little bit to at least explain that, Evan.
Yeah, so the lance formation has several pages of rules here, but the
We're not going to
basic
go
trick,
through them all.
yeah, the basic trick is that you get to be in a weird triangle, and the fact that everyone in the outer edge gets to fight as if they were in base to base means that if they're ground knights, they get their 2 attacks. If they're,
Mm-hmm.
if you put your Pegasus knights in lance, then they all get their attacks. If you have any spell that was able to give your knights the realm extra attacks, like the wrath of the lady or whatever that specific spell is
Whatever
called.
it is. Yep.
Yeah, being able to have more guys get to fight, and that's great. And I think the other thing about the lance is, if you see here, we have 7 guys being able to fight in this diagram, the darker color ones, but the width
Mm-hmm.
of our unit is only about 4. So that
Yeah.
means you can often have multiple lances hitting the front of a single unit and having a disproportionately high number of attacks to swing at them.
Yeah, very effective. There are a bunch of rules that go with it. We're not going to go over them all here, but you will see the majority, almost always, you'll see the Bretonnia player will put their units in the lance formation, even though it's not as powerful as it used to be with some of the updates they've done to it. It's still just that footprint size of more attacks in a smaller footprint for those multi charges or getting around things is very, very effective for positioning on the battlefield.
Yep. Well, I think that's it.
Yeah, and there's definitely more in there. Oh, beautiful models. Gotta love the beautiful models.
yeah, yeah,
Cool. All right, so we did it. We made it to the end of the review or high-level overview of the Bretonnian faction. Again, it's one of those armies that we love and is very, very popular. And I'm so happy that to see it not just in Old World, but one of the prominent armies in Old World, and a great starter box. Incredible new models they released for it with the characters and the knights on foot. That Duke on the Pegasus is just incredible. That model. And I think the team has done an excellent job with this book, and there's definitely a lot of different themes and such. And I'm excited to talk in the future about the Arcane Journal about it as well. So, any last thoughts on the Bretonnian army before we close this out, Evan?
I just think that if you've liked what we've done, if you've enjoyed our coverage, that maybe you'll give us a like on the video, a comment, to explain why you think I'm wrong about something. That'd be great. And if you want to subscribe, that also helps the channel. So, just if you got this far, I hope you would subscribe.
Yes, and again, thank you all for watching. And as always, we really appreciate the community and do our best to respond to all the comments that are out there. So please do like, share, subscribe, and help us grow the Old World community. That's all we have for this.
Stay legendary. I did it. See, I did the thing.
All right, bye.